Correct me if I'm wrong. I believe everyone on here has fishbowled already, right? So
Um,
let me rephrase the question. Is there anyone who has not fishbowled? Because this would be a great opportunity to do so. This is going to be our last class that we're meeting in person. And this is what I'll do too. Just in case you're not sure. So these are the names that I have. Marlon, Natalie, for the first one. Um, Danny, Elizabeth, Megan for the second one. Um, and then Natalie, Megan, Gladys, Sophia for Tuesday's fishbowl. It looks like everyone on here should be good. Um, Edgar, do you know if you fishbowled already, or could I possibly be missing your name?
I participated.
Okay, all right. So we should be good then. So at that, in this case, then since we don't need the fishbowl, I won't. And I don't have any notes for you guys because I really wanted to hear from you about what you thought about the documentaries. So we could either just open it up to whatever, or you could pull from what was discussed in your breakout rooms to have our conversation now. But at this point, we'll just have an open conversation about the materials. So what was discussed in your guys' breakout rooms?
We kind of touched on the aspect of like gangs because I grew up. I mentioned it in the group. I grew up in Watts, South Central LA area.
Mhm.
I'm I'm 40 years old, so and so I grew up like going to school, and I remember the school that I went to. If you showed up to class wearing red shoelaces, they would send you home. Blue shoelaces, purple shoelaces, and I think green. I think those were like the three or four gangs that were problematic in that area. So and like I like if it wasn't like the black gang members really wouldn't harass us. But I know like the brown gang members, I always got like hit up and asked where I was from and that kind of thing. Like I had friends who were in gangs and that situation. I've kind of been in and out of jail, and it's funny the dynamic changes when you go to jail. In jail, like all whatever gang you're with, brown or black, all that shit goes out the window. In jail, it's just they you get segregated in by color, and it's funny because it's just like the black people kind of forget about whatever happens in the streets and they kind of clump together. The brown people kind of it's a little different with brown people because you have Southsiders which are gangbangers, and then you have the paisas who are basically the guys that speak broken English,
Yeah.
kind of thing. And that's kind of who I always sided with because I wasn't a Southsider gangbanger, and I was just kind of like, I'm gonna go with these guys. 'Cause these guys are kind of neutral,
Yeah.
or whatever. And you have the white people, and it's like the dynamic that they talk about towards the end about like having like the common enemy. It plays out in jail because you kind of forget about the shit that happens in the streets. When you're in jail, you kind of stick to your own kind of thing. And about as far as like problematizing it seems like they had like if they had a goal. I think Helena talked about it, like if they had like a common goal, because if you look at the size of the Crip gang and the Blood gang, they're so big and they're like across the country. If they could just find a way to kind of organize, come together, and work with like a common goal, um, I don't know. That like that would be like the solution. But like with anything else, even like when there were groups who had common goals, whether it was the Black Panthers and the Us
Mm-hmm.
movement, they had their little. I'm gonna use the word tiff
Yeah.
for lack of a better word.
Yep.
It's just they had their little. It's like yeah, you have to have like a common goal and be willing to uh, push forward with that agenda if that is ultimately your goal. Like put all your shit aside and kind of come together for just this one thing. Yeah.
Danny, you brought up a lot of interesting points. So, one, the you being attentive to how during in jail culture, right?
Yes.
A lot of the street problems, you have to put that aside for a while. And then towards the end of the documentary, um, the difficulty of putting things aside, putting things aside when it's your homeboy who got killed. Right. So
Yeah.
how do you reconcile those differences? But then, you also mentioned like the goal and the common like focus for these gangs. And it made me think about two individuals from the Black Panther Party, Fred Hampton and then Apprentice Bunchy Carter. I don't know how many of you know about Bunchy Carter's backstory. So Fred Hampton, he's more centralized in Chicago. Bunchy Carter was in L.A. If you know about the history of gangs and the history of gangs within this country, Chicago and L.A. are like the hotbed of gang activity. Like so, a lot of those are like the two foundations. So you would have like your vice lords, you would have your gangster disciples, and you have your Latin kings. That would be out of Chicago. And then LA, of course, we have the whole Bloods and Crips phenomenon. So what Fred Hampton was able to do was able to politicize the vice lords, the gangster disciples, and the Latin kings. Also build alliances with the poor whites of Chicago, right? So that's what really made him a threat, and that's why this movie, the Judas and the Black Messiah, is kind of touching on the life of Fred Hampton. On the West Coast, we had Bunchy Carter. So what I typically do also during this section, I'm gonna put Edgar. I'm gonna put you on mute real quick, bro. Um, Typically, what I do on this section also is I have a little interview from Nipsey Hussle to kind of add to the conversation and bring a little bit more of a contemporary analysis. But for those familiar with LA, the street Slauson runs from like downtown all the way down near to West LA, right? So and they talk about this in the movie. The Slausons were like the main gang that kind of developed in like the late '60s, early '70s. It was the Slausons and the businessmen. But what Bunchy Carter was able to do was politicize the Slausons and the businessmen and turn them into Panthers, right? And then what happens is the people, so for example, let's just say that the Slausons become Panthers. Some of the businessmen, which were the rival gangs, would join the US organization, right? So you already have this seeming tension that's building between the US and the Panthers based on former gang ties, right? And then so as they become more politicized and J. Edgar Hoover and COINTELPRO begins to kind of further add flames to that dissension, you have things like the shootout at UCLA. So is anybody familiar with UCLA, there's a hall called Bunchy Hall, right? And this is where all the Black studies happens at Bunchy Hall on UCLA's campus. It's the equivalent to on Cal State LA, all the Pan African Studies courses are held in King Hall, right? It's like an homage to Dr. King. So where at UCLA they have it as an homage to Bunchy Carter. The reason being, so at the time, the work that the Panthers and the US organization were doing in LA were taking folks from the streets and trying to funnel them into colleges, right? And they were trying to cultivate what would Black studies look and feel like on the campus of UCLA. And it was going to be, will the Panthers run what Black studies will look and feel like, or will it be the US organization? And they have this meeting on campus to determine who will move this program forward. So what Hoover is doing is he's sending letters to the Panthers saying that the US organization is doing X, Y, and Z. They're threatening the lives of Panther members, right? But then to the US organization, they'll send letters saying that the Panthers are threatening US organization members. So they're creating this tension and exacerbating this tension. So when it comes time to have the students vote for who will run the program, a shootout ensues. And Bunchy Carter and John Huggins get killed by members of the US organization, right? And to me, that's the equivalent of them talking about in the documentaries how the police would come in, steal gang members' cars, do drive-bys in the rival gangs, and say, well, your so and so shot your homeboy because it was their caprice that was on the scene when it happened, right? So when these gang truces come into play, because as it says in the documentary, gang activity, especially in LA, is lucrative for the police department, right? The police are going to make sure that these tensions continue because they need it to get their gang prevention funding, right? A lot of the militarization of the police force came in with the invention of gang task force and drug task force, right? So a lot of these tensions are beneficial for the powers that be. And a lot of what you're saying, Danny, I kind of was hearing some of that through there. I also agree. So you say you're 40, I'm 37. So we kind of came up in the same era. And I mentioned, so I grew up in Pomona and then moved to Rancho. So in Pomona we had like Trey 5.7s and 4.56, and it wasn't really like colors per se, but like where you lived in Pomona would determine your gang. And that's kind of the same there too, but it wasn't more so like the Bloods and the Crips. It was those 4.56 and the Trey 5.7s. But especially for marginalized groups, this gang culture in the 90s was so pervasive, and that was like the biggest fear of most parents, was just like not to get your kids caught up in gangs. But at the same time, while that's going on, that is really promulgated and is really promoted to the youth as popular culture, right? 90s gangster rap, 90s gangster movies, right? So everything that was cool that you've seen from black culture was kind of positioned and given to you and presented to you through this auspice of gang activities, right? Um, so it's a really interesting phenomenon. But then to find the origins of the gangs, it also kind of, for me, it complicated it more, right? Because it's like, here's something that originally was intended to be a supporting force, and you want to identify with it because it's cool, but then you see in your now, the damage that these gangs are doing to the communities, right? So it's a funny thing to kind of oscillate in between. But again, history and historical context becomes important because you see that's not really what they started off to do, right? But again, gangs, guns, and money get involved, and the origins kind of become undermined and undervalued. Other thoughts on the documentary? We also have the LA '92 documentary as well that we could talk about.
One thing, a question I have about the Rebellion 92, and the documentary is like, I want to do an in-depth examination of the looting, all the looting that happens, not even just during all big rebellions and protests like this. There's always a looting, and the news and the media portrays it in different ways, and create these narratives around it. But I want to know, like, what does it mean about society? How does it relate to the problems that they're protesting? And you know, they say like in George Bush's address, they say like, the point, he missed it. He focused on the looting,
Right.
and really separated law-abiding citizens from like the bad looters and stuff like that. And so I want to understand, like, how the looting is, what role does it have, what's its significance, and like, what does it really say?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a very good question, and I think really that could be a dissertation within itself. Natalie, did you want to address Helena's question, or you had a separate question?
No, I had more questions that pertain to Helena's questions.
Okay, yeah, let's continue within that space then. Go ahead, Natalie.
Um, so when I was watching LA 92, me and my mom had this question as to like why they decided to loot their own neighborhoods, because wouldn't that hurt like black people's mom and pop shops and
Hmm.
things like that? And why not go to somewhere where you can make the most damage, like Beverly Hills?
Yeah, I agree, but practically speaking, it's two things at play here, right? Um, One, just the practicality of transportation, right? So I'm about to drive from Watts to Beverly Hills, tear up some shit, and then drive back to Watts. Like that's practically that's not going to happen. And then a lot of the people, right, don't even have cars. So what, you gonna hop on the bus, steal some shit, take it on the bus, and then, you know what I mean? Like that's just it's not practical. Two, the police. Like they're not gonna let you go to Beverly Hills and tear up some shit. You will all die. You know what I mean? And this ties to Helena's question in the sense of the looting. I got you, Danny, because with the looting for me, it symbolizes is value. right? So I put more value on I put more value on property than I do certain people's lives, right? And also, I could propagate the looting to devalue the real issue here, right? So that's a great way to divert attention instead of saying, well, the problem is these cops killing folks. We have to remain law and order. We can't damage property, right? Look at what you're doing to your own community. These are the respectability politics themes that they throw to devalue the justifiable angst that causes these things to take place. So that's how I would kind of respond to that. It's a way. And then to me, I always think about this notion, and you see it on the police card, right? To protect and serve. What it really should say is to protect and serve property, because that's really what they're more concerned with. Danny, you wanted to say something, then we'll go to Megan.
They confined it to the area.
Yep.
So the reason that they did it in their own neighborhoods, it was the police, but at some point there was a military presence. I remember at the front of our house, we lived on an intersection, and there was a Humvee with 2 armed soldiers, and they would rotate in a 24-hour period. We'd see a different group of soldiers every single day. So it was like basically like the organized protests, or a government funded protest that we talked about a couple days ago. It was kind of like that. Like, they kept the people within like this corral, for lack of a better word. They kind of kept them within this corral. So yeah, you guys can go fuck shit up, but just keep it
Here.
within. Keep it here. Yeah, keep it here. And I remember going in and out of that checkpoint, like you had to like identify yourself. Where are you going, kind of thing. It was like, hey, where are you coming from? Where are you going? Where are you coming from? Where are you going, kind of thing. So they kind of kept it, all that violence and burning and looting, kind of to this selected area. I wanted to add that.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Thank you, Danny. Megan, you had your hand up. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure you guys can hear me okay first.
We can.
Okay. So, for Helena and Nat's question, I mean, I didn't really think about that, honestly, but I will say, I mean, I wasn't even alive for the riots, for Rodney King and everything, but in the protest that I was in, last summer, the organizers, when you started to leave the bounds of the richer communities like Rodeo Drive, West Hollywood, they would start telling people to turn around, because they were like, this is not like the communities that we want things to get crazy in. And so I think it's kind of interesting that, I didn't even know the history of a lot of this, but it makes me wonder if they knew, and therefore they wanted to keep it in the wealthier areas. Like, they wanted to organize better, so then if people were, quote unquote, looting and shit like that, it wasn't in their communities, it was in like these rich ass communities. So I think that's just like an interesting perspective from then to now.
Yeah, definitely. And then I think too, another thing in the space of Natalie's question in regards to your own property, like, by and large, right? Majority of the black folks weren't owning businesses in those areas. There were business owners, I'm not saying that, but for the most part, right? It wasn't like 90% of those buildings were owned by black folks, right? So there's this notion of destroying your own, it wasn't really there. And I don't know if y'all picked up on it, another very subtle tension that adds to the LA rebellions of 92 were the Korean store owners' treatment of blacks that would go in those convenience stores, right? And there's another documentary on Netflix if you want to do further research. It's called A Love Song for Latasha, and it's talking about Latasha Harlan, who was shot by the Korean store owner because she thought she was stealing orange juice, right? And that's another thing that added the fuel to the fire of those rebellions, because also, I don't know if you guys peeped, they were very targeted on some of the stores that they would hit. Right, they knew who was owning what stores. They knew some of the negative background that they had with some of these store owners. So that's another thing that adds to the tension, and which I also found interesting. So we're talking about carving out these borders for cities, right? When it happened in '92, they carved out their own border as well. And the only person who could go into South Central would be a person of culture, right? And if you was European descent, if you were of Asian descent, they would riot on you, right? I.e. Reginald Denny, right? But if you pay close attention to that documentary, the people who are carving out that border for South LA, those are gang members. Like, if you watch, they'll tell you who can come here down this street, and then they'll throw up their set to let you know what set they from, right? So when you think about the Panthers, you think about the bastards of the party, and you connect that with the LA 92 rebellion, you see them serving their original role that they were intended for, although it's done, under a false guise, right? But they're still doing this role of kind of policing their community, so to speak, right? Saying who gets a pass, like, nah, that's a brother, don't run up on their car. Nah, that's one of the indigenous people, don't run up on their car. They live here, they're from our community, they get that pass, right? But if you ain't from our community, we snatching your ass up out that car, right? So you still see, even in times of duress, them reverting back to their original formation and why they came to be. Other thoughts about the documentary? What do you guys think about? So we read In Defense of Self-Defense, and it talks about violence from a standpoint of defending yourself, right? And then thinking about what you guys are saying in regards to how the protests get classified and they get positioned in the mass media, right? They talk about the violence done to property, and they equate that to the violence that are done to people, right? So again, this notion of violence is kind of a central theme in the material this week. And to me, does that violence against property, is that justifiable, right? Because I think one of the things that we struggle with as marginalized groups is how do and when do you justify the use of violence or the use of force, right? And if we are to take this to a more abstract understanding, violence against property, right? Is it ever justifiable? Can it be justified? What are you guys' thoughts on that?
I have a hard time justifying it. I don't know if I'm just a pacifist by nature. So I have a hard time justifying any kind of violence. And I'm kind of familiar with the circle of violence. It only begets more violence. It only begets more violence. It may not be now, but further down the line, maybe you do something to somebody, either their family member will come after you, or, maybe years down the line, it grows into this big old thing where all of a sudden, like the Bloods and the Crips, where they're like fighting against each other and they don't know like where it all started. There was a thought of like maybe it started with, what was it, the leather jacket or something that happened out at the Palladium kind of thing. So I have a difficult time trying to justify any violence, just because it never seems to solve anything.
Yeah.
From life experience and from things that I've seen, it's just that I've never seen any justification for violence.
Yeah, it's the old adage, an eye for an eye leaves the world blind, right?
The world, yeah. Like you can look at like the Middle East and everything that's going on there. It's just like it's been a constant thing. Like in the Middle East, there's never been peace there because it's like us against them, and it's thousands of years, and it's just like they're in their heads. It's the way it's always been. It's the way it's always been. We don't know why we don't like them. We just know we don't like them.
Yeah.
That's just
No, definitely. It's understandable, and I think that's the most humanistic way to look at it. Just to be real, right? Like that's the only way that we will humans will survive this situation, right? But also, to me, I can't separate power also from my analysis, right? Because that's the only thing that power responds to is a superior power, Natalie, you had your hand up?
I think violence on property, you can always rebuild property, but you can't take, or like, your life is lost, through hundreds and hundreds of years. You can't get those people back. So it doesn't compare.
Yeah, I agree. One of my favorite thinkers is a man by the name of Fred Moten. He used to teach at UC Riverside. I believe he's at NYU now. He also spent some time in North Carolina. But he has this thing in the book called The Undercommons, where he calls he makes this claim of the debt that's unrepayable, right? And like the slave experience, the enslaved experience is a debt that cannot be repaid. And I think that's really what you're talking about, Natalie, is like, you can't, lives lost, you can't repair that, right? False prison sentences where you spend 25 years in jail for something that you did not do, you, no amount of money could give you that time back, right? These settlements that these families are getting that are multi-million-dollar settlements, that does nothing to compensate for that person losing their father, losing their mother, losing their brother, losing their son, etc. Right? So again, it's this notion of the debt that can't be repaid. But also, Natalie, to your point, not only could you rebuild that property, a lot of that shit is insured, right? So you're going to get the insurance claim, and you'll probably get to build that back better than what it was in the first place, right? So again, this notion of the debt that cannot be repaid. Megan?
Going off of, the topic right now, I would like to, before any political party, I would like to think of myself as a humanitarian. And a lot of people would put that with like pacifism, but to me, like what you guys are saying, property can come back. Like, and I said it last week in our last session, I'll say it again. Like, if this country is built off the backs of these people, and they're still not getting, what they need from this country, what else can you do for, media attention? Like, I can't imagine how many unjustified murders happen that we don't hear about, that don't get these big movements and these big riots. So like, to fuck shit up, let me tell you, the world is listening. And I feel like if there's no lives lost in that, it's justified. I personally think that's fine because, like you're saying, it's insured. It can come back. But what is going on is happening again and again. So, if a Target burns down, if an Amazon warehouse builds down, these people are billionaires. They're going to be fine. And so it just, to me, it doesn't matter. But, that's just my personal opinion on it.
Helena?
Yeah, when we talk about like power, just I had this thought come up about how like, after 9/11 and these two powerful kind of like landmarks, and so many people, all people, no matter who you were, lives were lost, people were affected. And then I'm Canadian, what am I saying? America, the government of America, we went, why do I keep saying we? Okay, they went and they tried to get their vengeance on the Middle East, on the terrorist groups. Makes sense. Terrorism is in no way justifiable, but the white system has terrorized Black people and people of culture and indigenous people since the beginning of time, of America's time.
Yep.
And when the National Guard came and like they were like, I never thought I would see this in our home, so on our home soil, be doing this. And LA literally looked like a war zone. And still what was going on was, I think they were in Iraq, going crazy there on their property, damaging their property, destroying that country. Still, I even think back, like one of my favorite topics is Vietnam and the war there. And I think back of how America destroyed Vietnam and in the Middle East. But it's LA, and then they're working so hard to arrest people and cover up. They were basically trying to cover up the stuff that's happening. And the problem was of police brutality and terrorizing Black people was so shifted. And again, I'm touching on so many different topics, but like all the problems are connected. But yeah, the power then, like, the problem after 9/11, it took a little bit over 10 years, I think, and they got Osama bin Laden. The problem here, I'm not trying to, say one incident is worse than the other, but you know, the government wants to solve problems, but they did not solve this problem. They did not really address it even, and or even take responsibility for it. And it again, it just shows the lack of power, or sorry, the power disparity. Yeah, it's troubling.
Megan?
Yeah, before I go on my whole tangent, I just want to completely agree with Helena. Like, we have our hands in every lucrative pot around the fucking world, and we will bomb and terrorize and, you know, just steal resources from every country we have, and then somehow shift it onto like that was their fault. And so when you're saying like these power dynamics, I'm just like, it's fucking everywhere. Like I saw, you know, we have US troops guarding, what is it? What's the plant that makes opium? Whatever that is. Like there's fields of opium, or fields of, I think it's poppy flowers.
Yeah.
Yeah. In the Middle East. And you have like dudes with like fat guns. And I'm like, for what? Y'all are guarding like an international drug trade. But everyone's cool with that. But the moment, you know, the people who are being tyranted by the same people who are guarding that shit, you know, starts doing some shit here, then it's a problem. And we need to shut it down at, you know, whatever cost that is, no matter how many people die, no matter how many people are injured. So totally agree with that. But what I really wanted to talk on was the Bastards of the Party. That shit blew my mind, because you're telling us to, you know, make these strings of connections, and I had to like sit with it for like an hour, because there's so many things I didn't know. You know, I heard the terms like black on black violence, which, you know, I've read that that's no longer the term, which should have never been a term. But like, you know, the war on drugs, we had the fucking, God, what was that? It was like some system that comes to primary school that they're like, don't do drugs. And, you know, and you're in like 5th grade and you're like, what is going on? And how that can stem from that. But in the documentary, he was saying that in order to literally take someone's life in for, you know, your gang, to protect your people, you have to dehumanize that person. You know, no names, you call them an it or them. And I'm just like tracing this back to, you know, slavery. Like in order to do something like that, you have to shut down a part of yourself or dehumanize that person. And so basically I just threw a little outline. I was listening to this because my brain was like going crazy. But you know, you bring all these people here for the revolution, for, you know, LA is up and coming before it's even really LA. You have all these industrial jobs. So you have all these people coming and start creating like a culture. And then all of a sudden, you know, you can't get housing in certain places. So you shove them all into one place. And so then, you know, something starts to go there, you know, Black Panther Party like starts to make something, help educate people, help create these programs. And then all the jobs get pulled. So then you just have all these people sitting there, can't provide for their family, can't eat, can't move anywhere. You don't have money. And so then, you know, you see these gangs start to form, but they're talking about the collapse of, you know, the Black family. And I'm like, gang culture, and at least from what I know, is surrounded by this idea of like togetherness, you know, ride or die, you got each other. That's family ideals. Yeah. So you have these people looking for that because, you know, people are leaving, you know, families are getting ripped apart, things like that. And so then you have, you know, one person kill another person. So then you have gang retaliation. You have people willing to put their lives down for their family. And then you have, you know, drugs pumped in. So all of a sudden people are making money so they can move out of these places. And then right as that's starting to happen, you have police going into these communities, having the same firepower as these people trying to defend their communities with what, 6 months training. No one can learn this shit I can't even handle a class of a semester in 6 months. And so you're having these people go in, and it was so funny. I don't know if the doc did it on purpose, but you have photos of these gang members with heavy firepower and like photos of them, and then directly after you have the photos of the police people, the same thing. But for some reason, one of them seems so much better than the other. And so you have these people invading these communities, shutting this shit down, once again shoving them back into the same communities that they're trying to get out of. And then boom, prison system. And then he's talking about human storage. And I'm like, it was all about human storage the whole time. You brought them over in boats, to make them do your work. And then you shove them in these communities with no way out, storage, and then prison systems. We have more prison systems in California than we do fucking school systems. And I'm just like, all these thoughts are coming up, and how white people are profiting off of it the whole time, the whole way. Gangs, I was watching the movie that you mentioned, Judas and the Black Messiah, and how the fucking FBI had their own little thing putting flyers on these persons' porches saying, oh, these people are doing this, and doing the same thing to the other people. And I'm like, it's all for profit. This whole thing is for profit at the stake of human life. And I was so, my heart hurt. It was like devastating that we are learning about these connections, and that the whole way you see all this dehumanization of people. So therefore they have to do it to their community for a little bit of power. That's all that is. I was reading a book, and it was talking about how the patriarchy hurts men too, especially, Black men, and how a gang looks pretty good when you don't got no money, when your family's hungry, when you want something. And so that little bit of power, you have to dehumanize someone within your community.
Yeah.
So I know that was like a super long thing, but my mind was just like rattling this whole time about all of it. It's devastating because white people had their hand in the pot the whole time.
And it's orchestrated, right? So like when you talk about the drugs and the guns, how did they get there, right? And then in the documentary, he mentions like just on the tracks, kind of down south LA, so train track full of ammunition. They just found that, right? So like, how does that get put into the conversation? I'm gonna say this last thing about what you're mentioning, Megan, in regards to the dehumanization to be able to commit these acts of violence against one another. If y'all have time on YouTube, it's a really, really good interview with Nipsey Hussle, and I believe Peter Rosenberg and Ebro I forget what their show is called, but what Nip says, and it's so profound, right? And he says, when you're in a gang and you're going to do a mission, and use your imagination on what the mission is, right? You don't look for someone who does not look like you, right? And he says, so if you see a white person, they get a pass. You see a brother in a suit, they get a pass, right? But when you see someone who has the opposing color on, but their attire is similar to yours, but they're on the other side of the track, right? They walk and they have that same disposition as that you have because you're both in a gang, right? That makes them susceptible to that mission, right? So that's somebody who that does not get a pass. But what he's saying is the person who does not get a pass most similarly reminds you of yourself, right? And so think about Du Bois's concept of double consciousness. Seeing yourself through the eyes of the other. And it's only through double consciousness, the ability to dehumanize yourself and those who look like you, that you could really pull these acts of violence against your own, right? And he says it, you know what I'm saying? You at that point, you're not looking for your brother, you looking for a nigga to kill, right? And so it's a shift that you have to make to dehumanize it. And Megan, you said it eloquently. You hit the nail on the head. You have to be able to dehumanize to be able to do these type of things, right? And this is where this notion of double consciousness comes into play, because when he says two warring ideals that will tear the body asunder, if not for his dogged assurance, right? those are the two warring ideals. And those who are in the gang culture that pulls the missions on the other, the the gaze of white supremacy, or what I like to call white inferiority, is the won that battle, right? So you have now effectively viewed the world through the eyes of those who oppress you, right? So you lost this battle of double consciousness, and you're not doing the work that Du Bois is advocating for as it pertains to double consciousness in the sense of being your own true full self, right? And so I'm gonna end it with that. Megan, you had a comment? You're on mute.
Really quick, just going off of that, the speaker and best of the party is talking about how, it goes back and forth, retaliation, like this is your family, they killed a part of your family, so you're going to go do it to them, and then they're going to go do it to you, and it's back and forth and back and forth. And how you're going to teach your kids that, you're going to teach your kids what you know. And so this is like a generational thing that it makes sense why they don't know where it started, because all it matters is that they did something to you and the people that you care about, and so you have to do it back. And I think it takes a real fucking enlightened person to not want vengeance.
Yeah.
And so, like, trying to understand that mindset, I get it.
Yeah.
I can if someone tried to mess with my sibling, like, I don't, I feel like I have a different, perspective on how gangs work, because, it's human nature. And so one last thing I did want to say that I feel like I really also learned from this class in total was, you're talking about the Korean woman, that, what happened, and that there's a long history of violence and things like that between the Asian and the Black community. And, all these different communities and how they intertwine with each other. And I feel like in order to be a really good ally, or an ally in all, you have to understand where these people are coming from. How, fuck white people, fuck the government, all of these things. Like, and I hate when people are like, well, it wasn't me. It was someone that looked like you. And you have to, sit there and sit with that. And if you are in it for people to be like, oh, I'm so happy that you're here, blah, 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 I don't think that's being a good ally. And so I really have to, I feel like that's what I really got from learning all the history of this, is it's all human emotion.
Yeah.
It's all human connection, and how we just need to understand, like, I don't think anyone wakes up and wants to hate someone, or wakes up and wants to end up in a gang, putting your life on the line every day for what?
Yeah.
It's the history of it all is so intertwined that you just have to understand it.
Yeah.
To be a good ally, to be there for that community.
Yeah. Well said, Megan. What I want to do before we leave is kind of make sure, check in with you guys individually to see how you're progressing with your final paper proposals. So if you feel comfortable, please let me know what your topic is, and then I can kind of talk through some potential resources for you to help you secure your source material for your final paper proposal. So you should have at least 5, right? Does anybody want to start? Okay, go ahead, Natalie.
So I'm doing police brutality, but I'm not limiting it to only men, also women, because it's sometimes overshadowed.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, so I think with that being said, Breonna Taylor would be like the optimal case study, just because one, she got national attention because of what you're talking about, how everybody was talking about George Floyd, and she kind of gets left on the wayside, and then the community picks that up and says, well, we need to support her as well. I'm trying to think about some source material for you also, which you may want to think about looking at also if you were to write the paper, right? I was thinking about the role that women play to stand as intermediaries for police brutality and anti-lynching movement, for example. It's something that was started by Black women, right? So historically, women have always been the ones to pick up the slack there, for lack of a better phrase, when it comes to atrocities being put against Black people. So you can look into the anti-lynching movements for further source materials. There's a text from one of the founders of Black Lives Matter. It's called "When They Call You a Terrorist." That would be a good source material as well. And then one more I could provide to you is hashtag Ferguson, hashtag Baltimore. That's another great text that's dealing with the Black Lives Matter movement. Is more contemporary and ways to deal with police brutality. Because when you think about it, Black Lives Matter is an organization that is started by women, right? So that whole thrust is a women's desire to combat police brutality, right? So that's a whole organization that's come to the fore to combat police brutality. Also think about the women's role in the Black Panther Party. There's a text by, her name is Elaine Brown, who, when Huey was in jail, she actually took over as president of the Black Panther Party, and the book is entitled A Taste of Power, and it's like her autobiography. So that's another good source material that you could use to kind of support your argument. Marlon, welcome to the class today, man. What we're doing is kind of going around mentioning which your final paper proposal subject will be, and I'm going to try to provide you with some source material if you're struggling with that area, okay? Who wants to go next?
I'm doing mine on gun control and gun laws, only because of that. I had read an article regarding the law that just passed in Texas, where you're free to walk around with a gun without a permit and everything. And who's more likely to have a permit on them for a registered gun? It's usually white people are more in common, and somehow it's there's a little bias to that law where they kind of target Black people because there's the stigma of Black people. It's like obviously Black people are going to get pulled over more than white people, and the likelihood of a Black person having a permit because of their lack of trust in the government, XYZ. I'm going to explore more reasons as to why they wouldn't have a permit. And just in general, how like the Second Amendment is kind of has like this bias towards anybody else but white people.
I'm trying to find the text for you, or the author. I know the name of the text is called "We Will Shoot Back," and I want to say it's Robert Williams, but let me just double check that, because what this text is talking about is how the civil rights movement was really able to be successful and able to function because there were people in the civil rights movement who were armed, right? And a lot of times, I think it's called the Bloody March is one of them, when they marched, I want to say in Alabama, but there were armed people from the civil rights movement who were making sure that they were able to safely make their march. His name is, I'll put it in the chat because it's a little bit difficult to pronounce, but the title is "We Will Shoot Back," and it's and then also I don't know if you guys know, for California, the reason why we cannot open carry in our state is really because of the Black Panther Party. When they were trying to take away, because the Black Panthers started to arm themselves and started to walk around and patrol the streets, they took away California's right to carry guns, right? So what they did, the Black Panthers, to protest, they went to the state capitol armed to show that they were going to protest and support their right to bear arms. Bobby Seale, who was leading the thing, took a wrong turn and ends up at the state capitol, walks into the Congress meeting armed, right? And so now they use this idea that, the Black Panther Party stormed the Capitol with guns, which ensures that California should not be able to bear guns because these are the things that are going on. And I think in his autobiography, it's called "Seize the Time," Bobby Seale, he also speaks about that circumstance as well. So that's another way you could look at the problemization of gun control and the distinctions that's being drawn between who can rightfully carry a gun and who cannot rightfully carry a gun. That's a very interesting subject matter. And I think also somebody in California is trying to advocate to remove that law to where we cannot carry guns. They're trying to take that away, and that's happened sometime this week this happened. So that may be another resource to kind of look into. I don't remember the name of the congressman or the senator of California who wants to do this, but I did come across that information. I think Monday or something like that around there. Who's next?
I think I'm still deciding
Okay.
for sure, but what I'm leaning towards is like what Baldwin to talk about what Baldwin calls the white imagination, the maintenance of white imagination, and I want to talk about and connect that with double consciousness to talk about how um, Black people in America have been portrayed by the in film,
Oh wow.
and yeah, and a little bit touching on like minstrelsy, and then all the way up until like now.
Wow, that's really good. So definitely, you already have you have Souls of Black Folks for Double Consciousness. You have Fire Next Time for the White Imagination. There's also a text by Frantz Fanon called Black Skin, White Mask. He deals with this notion of double consciousness. Also, it's a great rounding about way to look at these ideas of minstrelsy and things of that nature because he deals with this notion called the white gaze, right? And how
Mhm.
the white gaze shifts and shapes ontological understandings of blackness, and that white gaze is extended through film and media. So I would also throw on there Black Skin, White Mask by Frantz Fanon. Um, while other people are going, Helena, I'm gonna grab another book. I'm gonna look to see if there's a chapter in this book that could be beneficial for you. So
Okay,
give me a second.
thank you.
Mm-hmm. Who want? Marlon, I know you put something in the chat. Um, okay, Marlon, did you want to go, man? And we'll let you know if you start to break up.
Yeah, sure, I'll go. I would write. I propose to write a paper on the self descriptions of African Americans, the term African American versus Black,
Okay.
and also other terms both from the past and from the future. It's something that I was kind of hoping to discuss in the class. I guess we didn't get around to it, but in the early 90s when I was in high school, and it seemed like the term African American suddenly became the main term for Black people to describe themselves. I had always called them Black people, and suddenly I was confused. Like, was I calling everybody the wrong thing? Was I considering people are African American the wrong thing? In the time since, I've also kind of thought a lot about what African American, as those terms mean, because not necessarily all Black people have a direct descendants from Africa as much as just anybody, as the theory goes, that everybody was descended from Africa. It's been something that's fascinating to me. Plus, automatically calling an African American doesn't always make sense. For example, look at Black Panther. Black Panther is the first African American superhero. Not the case. He's an American. So that's just all. It's always. I mean, I'm not arguing this. I've never tried to argue this. I just want to understand it.
Yeah.
And as I was actually, I put together my proposal last night. It's all done. And I looked up. I've found a wealth of citations or just articles on it.
That last part, you kind of breaking up, Marlon.
Really kind of wish I could write this paper. I think it would be really interesting, but I've pretty much got it written. So
Okay.
I mean, you can contribute if you like, but it's kind of ready to go. I'll give it a polish of a week and then send it up.
Okay. It sounds like you're pretty. Is that mine?
So yeah.
Okay. It sounds like you're pretty far.
I just said that I pretty much wrote the whole thing already.
Okay.
So it's ready to go. I'll do a polish on it, but if that sounds okay to you, I'm gonna jump out this weekend.
Yeah, and I think you're good. Sounds like you're on.
No, if there's a problem on my end, you've always sounded fine. It's the problem on my end.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
No worries, man. It sounds like you're on track, Colin.
But
I don't think you really need any more sources. But just because you are interested in it, I'm going to email you it's not a documentary, but it's actually a conversation that takes place in the early 90s. And it's literally a conversation. What do African people call themselves moving forward? Is it African American? Is it Black? Is it Afro American? And it's different people representing different factions. And one of the individuals who, is a hero of mine, Stokely Carmichael, who also is referred to as Kwame Ture, he's on there. And he becomes really important because he's one of the people who helped the process go from Negro to Black, right? Through the term Black Power. So that would be a great person to kind of situate yourself within if you do choose to write this story. I'll send you that for sure, but he's a great person to kind of place yourself in to kind of get the evolution of that. From a personal standpoint, I think I like to drop the hyphen, and I just go with African, right? For me, it's either Black or it's African. I say Black because of the aligning itself with the negritude movement. It's this notion of taking control of our identity, right? And Negro was placed on us, right? All these things were placed on us, and I think Black is the first definition that we gave ourselves, right? Or we took that definition and made it ours. But to me, again, from a standpoint of this Afro-American, Malcolm X's speech, The Ballad of the Bullet, is very beneficial also because he talks about not being American because not being able to receive the fruits of Americanism. But for me, I situate ourselves as we're African people, right? I don't know how much I agree with the idea that not all Black people come from Africa. I think we are direct descendants from Africa. And no, it's not to equate it to the notion of everyone comes from Africa. No, we have a stronger cultural connection. We have a stronger genetic connection. We have a stronger DNA connection to the continent. So for me, I would situate ourselves as purely African people. I think that's the appropriate epistemological term. I think it's the most appropriate historical and political term. But that's just my personal opinion. Especially coming from someone who views myself as a Pan-Africanist, right? Yeah, that cultural connection becomes most important. And just real quick, right? There's so many things that we don't even know. For example, like a lot of the slang that we use has direct linguistic connections to African languages, right? The Black inability to use the ER and like phonetically place the A at the end, that's a direct tie to African linguistic speech. For in African drumming, right, your middle finger is the finger that you use to provide the bass drum beat, right? So this is African musical science. But here in the States, when you DJ and you think about hip hop, right, is an art form that came out of Puerto Rican and Black culture. The same finger that you use for that drum beat is the same finger that the DJ uses to scratch the record, right? So these are these cultural connections that are very obscure and abstract, but they speak to our Africanity, right? You mentioned Black Panther. Ryan Coogler has this interview where he's talking about how he requested Marvel to allow him to go back to Africa so he could have a better sense while he's creating this film. And he says that while he's traveling in South Africa, the people who he's taking, who's giving him the tour, is like, I'm gonna take you to a ritual. He's like, all right, well, I'll go with y'all to this ritual, right? But when he gets there, it's all the youth outside, outside the home, shooting the shit, talking, what have you. He goes inside, it's the women congregating around the kitchen doing the cooking, and he goes in the back, and it's all the elder men in the back hanging out. And his response was, well, damn, this is exactly what we do at my home in Oakland, right? And even when I go to my house functions and I go to my cousin's function in LA, the dynamics of that is exactly the same. My wife is Eritrean from East Africa. We go to visit a wedding in Arizona for her family. The dynamics of that are exactly the same. So I just bring up this point to show you that cultural connectivity is so strong, we don't even realize the connections that we make and the ties that we have to the African continent as African people. Sorry to kind of take up everybody else's time, but I just wanted to kind of get that point across. Who would like to go next?
I'll go real quick.
Okay.
My first idea was just how like familial ties and like familial wanting can lead to, introductions into gangs. But I feel like that might be a little out of my depth and like understanding. And so then I wanted to go back to the suppression of Black joy. And then Helena also gave me an idea of like how that is not in the media whatsoever. You never see, Christmas movies, like those cheesy, stupid Christmas movies with like a Black couple or even an interracial couple. And then when you guys are talking about Black Panther, the movie, how the protagonist or the anti whatever, like the Killmonger, that was his name, how he saw, Wakanda and how it's all great and everyone's like happy and all these things, and how he just wanted that for all the rest of the Black and African American community in the rest of the world. But then somehow like he got like, crazy and like radicalized. And I was like, what? Like even in a movie about, Black people, like you have a bad guy when it just, yeah. So just like how media portrayal, of this community, even in their own movies, it never goes, in a good way.
Yeah. That is the only critique I had of the movie Black Panther. It's like, low key, Killmonger made the most fucking sense. Like, if y'all got all these weapons, all these spears and technology shit, why only Wakanda get to benefit from this? There's there's a whole world of Black folks who could use this, right? So yeah, I'm with you on that. I would say look into the Black codes because those are really designed to suppress Black joy, right? The inability to congregate. So if it's 3 or more people in one area, they would force you to go separate ways. I mentioned the laughing cans where you had to stick your head in those laughing barrels. Excuse me. That's another one. Also, there's a book that I want to say was published earlier this year. I don't remember the title of the book off top, but I will get it to you. What she's doing is she's researching Black leisure in LA. So how Black people would try to go to pools, how they would try to go to beaches, and how that would be repressed. I believe this past month or two, there were returned a beach, I want to say in Manhattan Beach, that was historically Black that they took from the owners. And they just now gave them their property back. I don't recall the name of the book, but I'll get that to you, Megan, because that'll be a great source material also to kind of think about this aspect of Black joy, because a great reflection of Black joy is how you spend your leisure time, right? So I'll get that out to you. Yeah, you're right, Marlon. I'm just looking at your comment. Yeah, shit, in my mind, he might have been the hero. You know what I'm saying? It just depends on how you want to look at it. Who wants to go next? I believe we have Edgar, Elaine, and Sophia. And if you guys don't feel like you need to, that's okay too. I just want to give you the opportunity to be able to, discuss your topic a little bit and get pointed in a direction for your source material.
Yeah, my topic, I took a language class before coming last semester, and we went on a big topic on African American language, like vernacular, how like pigeons and creoles. And then I liked the idea, I liked when we covered double consciousness. And then I just remember how in the class we were talking about code switching, but also talked about like situations where African Americans couldn't do that because they were suppressed. Well, Africans were suppressed and oppressed by their slave owners, and then they had to make a new Creole and a new pidgin just so they could, get across their message about certain things. And I wanted to do it on that just because I'm more knowledgeable on it. Because I was interested in language, and so kind of going on the history of how oppression just created just this whole different culture of languages. It would just be interesting for me to rate.
Yeah, so I put in the chat right now an author by the name of John Agbu. He's a Nigerian. He's migrated to America, and he did this research in Oakland in the mid '90s, specifically on Ebonics, or African American vernacular language. And what they did in Oakland in the mid '90s is they had this whole movement to where they're going to recognize Ebonics as an actual language, and the students who spoke Ebonics would be considered bilingual, right? And they'll be able to use their Ebonics in the classroom. And this went from, like, I want to say from 93 to about 97, 98. And what's fascinating, I don't know if you guys pay attention to folks from Oakland. So like Ryan Coogler, as I mentioned earlier, if you ever hear him in an interview, and I don't know if y'all been to Oakland, but Oakland has a very specific language. They have a very specific syntax and way of speaking, expressing themselves. Ryan Coogler he never code switches in his interviews. He always has that Oakland dialect. For y'all who are maybe sports fans, football fans, Marshawn Lynch, he's from Oakland as well. Same way. He always keeps his Oakland accent, his Oakland attitude. And I correlate that to the research that was being done at the time to where Ebonics was being recognized, right? So they came up in a school system that supported them in their natural state, not forcing them to code switch. So now when they're in professional settings, they don't feel the need to speak standard vernacular English, right? So that's John Agbu, and you could, it's a lot of articles, or not a lot of books, but there's articles that he's done that will be very beneficial for you. And then there's also Edward Glissant. I'll put that in the chat also. His article it's a book. It's called Poetics of Relation. And this really gets into the idea and the conversation around creolization. And what he's saying is what we should be attentive to is this idea of relation, right? So how people are brought together and what new things are being produced from that connection, right? So as you mentioned, in the enslaved experience, you have people who speak West African languages like Akan, Igbo, Hausa, Yoruba, right? But they're put in captivity by people who speak English, French, Portuguese, etc. Right? So these are a combination of languages coming together, right? And then now, not to mention people who may be kidnapped that speak other languages, right? So you have all these things circling, and it produces this new type of language that we call Creole, right? So that book is called Poetics of Relations, and it's by Edward Glissant. I'll put that in the chat for you. Also, I just want to make sure I spell Edward Glissant right, so that way you know how to research that. But definitely, this sounds like a really, really good topic. Who's next?
I kind of wanted to do my topic on this sense of community. Like how in the Black Panther movement, and also in gangs, there's a sense of community. I'm not sure how to expand more on that, but I want to focus on that.
Yeah. Okay. So with that one, Sophia, actually, I think the Poetics of Relation, what I just put in the chat for Elaine, is also would work for you as well. The reason being because if you think about this idea of relation, essentially this notion of community building, right? It's the same thing. So I would definitely use that as a starting point. There's a book, and actually the brother who wrote the book just passed. Is called Monster. Is the title of the book, and it's about his transition and his journey into gang life, and it really talks about how through lacks of father figures and lack of these support systems, this is what got him into gangs. His nickname is Monster Cody, but I don't recall his real name. But the book is titled Monster, and this is like one of the foremost books when it comes to like gang activity and trying to understand gangs. I want to say it came out in the mid '90s, and this was like the primary resource material. So those would be my two resources for you, Sophia. It would be the Edward Glissant Poetics of Relations and the Monster text. Um, okay, Marna, I see you in the text. You read that. It's a good book. It really is, and it provides some context to why people do what they do. And yeah, I want to say he made his transition, if not yesterday, the day before yesterday. Edgar, did you want to throw out your topic?
I was thinking of doing self-identity for double consciousness.
Okay. That's a good one. So of course you have the souls of Black folks. I would also think about Marcus Garvey. There's a book titled The Selective Writing and Speeches of Marcus Garvey. I'll put that in the chat for you. But Marcus Garvey, for me at least, is one of the foremost and primary thinkers that says, you know what, it's dope to be Black. There's a sense of pride that you should take in your Blackness. So I can't think about positive self-identity without thinking about Marcus Garvey. He really set the tempo for saying that, yo, this is who we are, and we should be proud of who we are. He's the one who came up with the Pan-African flag of the red, the black, and the green. That all came from his brainchild, right? So I would say anything you could find on Marcus Garvey would be generative. You have the Du Bois to talk about the double consciousness, and then Baldwin too, because really what he's talking about very subtly is being and taking pride in yourself. That's the whole idea of the only way that you'll be destroyed is by believing you are what the white world calls a nigger, right? So this is this notion of don't buy into that, be secure in who you are, right? So would be my three sources for you. Baldwin, anything dealing with Marcus Garvey, and then the souls of Black folks. All right, we just hit 12:30. I think we got everybody's topics, and I've kind of pointed you in the right direction. You have the whole weekend. If anything comes up, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Go ahead, Natalie.
Do you have like how many chapters you would want? Like
For chapters for what?
Because last time you said that in your paper how you didn't have like the chapters, and like in this first chapter I will be discussing.
Okay, so it's hard to do that because you're not writing the paper. You know what I mean? So like we don't know what you would how you would go about that. So I'm not gonna knock you if you don't have that, because it's really hard to like imagine how you would attack a paper without actually writing that paper. So you won't lose points if you don't have that. But really what I'm looking for in the abstract is the question that's driving the research, right? How you will be, like why the sources that you chose are important, right? So for those who are talking about double consciousness, I'll be engaging W.E.B. Du Bois's Souls of Black Folks because he deals explicitly with this notion of double consciousness. In fact, Du Bois is the one who coined this term double consciousness, right? So just speaking on how you're going to use each source, or why you chose that source and why that's relevant. And just kind of a summary as to why the topic is important for you, what you're looking to get out of the research, right? So any type of what they call a hypothesis that you may want to draw or conclude, you can include that into your abstract. Typically, and this is nothing that you guys will be graded or held responsible for, but also in your abstract, you would have your method, right? So I'm taking a sociological approach. I'm taking a psychoanalytic approach. I'm taking a epistemological approach, right? But we didn't get into that, so I won't hold you guys accountable for that. But I do want to let you know if you're doing abstracts in other spaces, that's something else that you want to include in your abstract, that methodology, right? And another way to think about that is the first portion of your journal, right? That's what I ask you for, is the thesis and then that method. Typically, you would include that method into your abstract as well. But again, I won't knock you if you don't have that. Good question, though. Any other questions?
So explaining the source, giving a little background on the source, is that in the abstract or in the bibliography?
That would be in the abstract. You would put that
Okay.
in the abstract. Yeah. Yeah. And so if we were to do an annotated bibliography, then they would look for that in the bibliography as well. But I'm not asking all that from y'all. I just want to know why you chose to make that source, right? To use that source, excuse me. Good question. Any other questions? All right. Well, it's a little different. This is my first time teaching an intermission course. It goes so fast, man. But what I do want to say is I truly appreciate y'all. I appreciate the space that we share together and allowing me to facilitate the information of this space. I learned a lot from you guys. Um, I want you to be encouraged to continue to be critical. Don't be afraid to cut against the grain, right? And more importantly, I think if anything that y'all pull from this class, just be your authentic selves, man. Like, and I think we talked about this idea of imposter syndrome. Like, throw that out the window, man. Like, if anything, right? You literally read PhD material. And if you could do that now, there's no reason why you can't go and get your PhD if you so choose to, right? So this idea, oh, I'm first generation student, fuck all that, man. Like you guys are brilliant within your own natural right, right? And this notion of we talked about African American male theory and the innate brilliance and the capacity for morality and intelligence of African people. I see that in each of every one of y'all in our conversations, in our engagements, right? And it's spaces like this and individuals like yourselves that allows me to be optimistic for our future, right? Because I think if we continue on this track and you guys continue on your professional paths, you'll be placed in situations where you'll have some advocacy and some power. And from our conversations, I do believe that you'll use your power in the right way. And your sphere of influence will kind of allow us to shift the society and to shift culture into a direction that's going to be sustainable, that's going to be humanistic, and it's going to allow us to get out of the muck and mire that we've been in for centuries, right? So I just want to thank y'all, man. It's been a tremendous pleasure. And please don't hesitate to reach out for me for anything. Y'all need a letter of reference. You want to think about going to grad school. I'll be happy to have those conversations with you all. Just please think of me as a resource because I'm more than happy to be that resource for you all. Thank you. All right, you guys.